Okay, great. Okay, so thank you everyone for being here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Teresa. I'm one of the co-founders of the European Policy Hub, which is a new higher student organization that was created with the objective of bringing the European perspective to the search for solutions for global policy challenges. This happens to be our first event, so we are very happy to have you all here. And I would like to thank the Stigler Center for partnering with us in organizing this event. This has been a very fruitful partnership, and we hope we can continue working in the future. We are also very grateful to the Harris Student Government and to the Graduate Council for their funding support. Finally, I would like to thank my 4 speakers. I'm going to present all of them. So first we have our moderator, who will be Professor Rolnik. He is clinical associate professor of strategic management at Toulouse School. Professor Rolnik is the co-organizer of the annual conference on competition and concentration that will be held tomorrow and Thursday in the Stigler Center of Chicago booth. His experience are in the fields of political economy of media and regulation. Professor Rolnik is an entrepreneur that founded the most influential financial newspaper in Israel. He's arguably one of the most influential business and economics journalists in Israel, promoting open competitive markets with strong social safety net, and is considered a leader in the fight against corruption. In 2013, Professor Rolnik was awarded the Sokolov Lifetime Achievement, a prestigious Israeli journalism award for founding The Marker, changing public discourse and influencing the government and legislators to undertake significant changes in the structure of the Israeli economy. I'm glad that Professor Rolnik could make it today because he had a lot of commitments, so thank you very much, Professor, for being here.
Thank you very much.
Our first panelist, Professor Cremer, has a PhD in economics from MIT. He is a professor at Toulouse School of Economics in France and director of its digital center since 2015. Professor Cremer is also a fellow of the Econometric Society and a member of its council. Last year, he was appointed special advisor to the European Commissioner for Competition, Margaret Vestager, focusing on future challenges of digitalization for competition policy. The result of that work has been summarized in a final report titled Competition Policy for Digital Era, published last April. Thank you very much, Professor, for coming all the way to Chicago and sharing your findings with us.
It's a pleasure.
Our second panelist, Dr. Sean Durkin, is Vice President at Charles River Associates, a leading consulting firm. He got his PhD in economics from University of Chicago and specializes in antitrust economics, damage analysis, econometrics, microeconomics, and international economics. He has extensive consulting experience in both competitor and class action cases, including a wide range of antitrust issues, including collusion, bundling, tying, exclusive dealing, and predatory pricing. Dr. Durkin has also taught at Harris and Booth. I am sure that your views from a more practical perspective will be very helpful and insightful. So thank you for joining us today. Finally, our third panelist, Sandeep Vaheesan, is legal director at Open Markets Institute. Open Markets Institute is, in its own words, a team of journalists, researchers, lawyers, and advocates working together to expose and reverse the stranglehold that corporate monopolies have on US. Mr. Vaheesan previously served as Regulations Counsel at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where he helped develop and draft the first comprehensive federal rule on payday, vehicle title, and high-cost installment loans. Thank you, Mr. Vaheesan, and we're very glad to have you here. So we would like this to be a very fruitful conversation, so please, guys, I encourage you to ask questions and express your views and participate today, so thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Teresa. Much appreciated on your initiative to host this event. So before we start, I want to do a quick round around all the panelists and get some context and background on what is it that they do and why they are so much interested in antitrust and how many years they've been doing that, to hear some context about them. But before I want to do that, I want to ask you a different question. So for me today, this is the third event that I'm moderating on antitrust. And tomorrow we're going to have 2 days of event on antitrust. And the question is it self-selection, or all of a sudden antitrust is a big issue around the world? What do you think?
I really don't know, because I was more a specialist of the digital market and of antitrust. Then I was asked to participate in the writing of this report. It was lots of fun. And now I'm getting about 3 invitations a day to participate in one day.
So you do know.
But I don't know whether this will be an increase in time or just a change in my position. I spend about half of my time trying to find polite ways to say no.
Okay, you should increase the price. That's how it works in the economics. Okay, Sandeep?
So that's a great question, Guy. I think the renewed interest in antitrust, I really situated within the sort of growing questioning of the ideology that's dominated really not just American society, but much of the world for the past 4 years, conventionally called neoliberalism. And I think antitrust has been arguably the most neoliberalized field of all, in that antitrust today has largely withdrawn from traditional concerns about mergers and monopolies, and has focused largely on corporate cartels and horizontal restraints of that nature. So I think this recent debate is emblematic of the larger question that's happened, especially since the 2008 financial crisis.
All right. Sean, please.
Yeah. You're not? Well, I'll use my teaching voice. For me, this is what I do, so it's always been important, and it's always been big, and it's always been kind of a lot of stuff going on. But I have gotten the sense, just from, I guess, reading press reports and things like that, that it's certainly a topic which has become more interesting and getting a lot more play. Certainly, had front page Wall Street Journal article yesterday about the Supreme Court rejecting Apple's appeal in the App Store case, which is a fairly not trivial sort of antitrust event, but one that got front page headlines. So I do think it's an area that's becoming increasingly important. And my wife will even say, "Oh, did you hear this?" So it's when we get to that point, we know it's becoming more important. So, and I think another thing also is there's a sort of burgeoning industry of having antitrust conferences, and so so you're going to keep getting them forever, Jacques, because there's a bunch of people out there making money at these conferences, so they're going to keep inviting you.
As far as I know, we are not making any money off this conference. Just to be, these all student volunteers. Nobody is getting paid here. So very quick a round of introduction. If you can tell us about your background in antitrust or digital monopolies or both. Jacques.
Okay, well, you don't care about my life.
We do, actually we do. We do.
So just let me tell you a little bit about the story of the report we wrote. That's kind of a fun story. So about a bit more than a year ago, I received an email asking me whether I wanted to be a special advisor to Commissioner Vestager. I really can't pronounce the name very well. And to write a report on the digital economy. So the Commission did that in a way which I think turned out to work pretty well, but which was a little bit risky because they chose 3 people from 3 different fields who didn't know each other and said, now write a report together. So the 2 others were Yves Alexandre de Montjoie, which for any Europeans has such a beautiful Belgian name, who was an assistant professor at Imperial College, was a specialist in privacy. He was a data scientist specializing in privacy. And Heike Schweitzer, who's a law professor at Humboldt University in Berlin. And You were told now you have, don't quit your job, it was very much a part-time thing. And you've got 1 year to write a report explaining to the world how competition policy should work. So you begin, you're very excited, you learn lots of stuff. Then around December, so we got started in April. Around September, December, you begin panicking. In March, you die as you try to make sure that you've got the right number of maybes in the report. You don't want to have too many, but you need to have a few. And so, I think we need to have an interesting discussion. But it seems to me that if you look at the way the debate in the States is going, the way the debate in the States is going on antitrust, you have really, it's dominated by, in some sense, two extreme positions. One position, which is to say, we should use traditional, the debate on antitrust in the digital market, in the digital economy. Part of it says, well, we should use the traditional tools of the digital of antitrust in order, in this new world. After all, we've got a long tradition which has been working pretty well, and we should keep on using it. Now, it turns out that as a matter of practice, it means that there is very, very little antitrust happening in the digital economy, even though you see the development of very, very large platforms and, very large firms who could have lots of market power. On the other side, and my neighbor to the right would be a representative of this tendency, you've got a more rather radical viewpoint, which thinks of those platforms as being very detrimental to the welfare of American society, and typically call for very strong action and very often breakups. And with Senator Warren's call for this very radical position. And our report is very much centrist in the middle. Sometimes say that my political philosophy was that I was an anarchist from the center, and the report is very much in the. We think that there should be more the temperature of antitrust and competition policy should be increased. And we make some proposals in the report. We may discuss some of them, in particular shifting some burdens of proof and so on. We think it's still worthwhile to keep on using competition policy rather than doing more radical solutions, which I don't think we control very, of which we really don't know exactly what they're going to bring. But we'll have time to debate this.
Okay, Sandeep, you're the radical. You've been accused of being radical.
It's not an accusation.
So, I've been practicing as an attorney for almost 10 years now in the government as the Financial Protection Bureau, and also as an advocate currently at the Markets Institute, previously at the American Antitrust Institute. And before law school, I was an economic consultant for a couple of years. And so I've seen antitrust from both the economist's perspective, or aspiring economist's perspective, as well as the lawyer's perspective. And I think one lesson I've really learned from my experience is that all markets are products of rules. There's no such thing as a market without rules. The question is, do those rules promote what we would generally think of as socially desirable outcomes, which include goods and services, good wages, opportunities for entrepreneurs, and true economic and political democracy? Or do the rules promote concentration of power, corporate capture of politics, and reduced wages for workers? So I think the question is not whether the government acts, but how it acts and what ends it tries to further. So I think our contribution and perspective to this debate is the rules that we have in the United States today are not working for the vast majority of Americans. The rules are working very well, not only for tech platforms, but for other large corporations, whether it's pharmaceuticals, telecom, healthcare, transportation, you name the sector. You're likely to see a concentration problem there. And we believe that traditional approach to antitrust in the United States, so the rules that really defined American anti-monopoly law from the 30s to the 70s, actually worked quite well, coincided with the time of robust economic growth, broad-based prosperity, and that those rules really offer a model for us going forward. So certainly relative to practice over the past 4 years, our perspective seems radical, but I think looking further out, looking further back in time, our positions and policy prescriptions are well within the American political and policy mainstream.
Thank you. Sean, please.
Well, sure. So I was formerly a full-time academic and got involved in economic consulting sort of by accident. And the first case I ever got worked on was the US versus Microsoft case in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I sort of learned, I was thrown into these sorts of issues right away. It was a case in which a big tech company was sued. There were lots of different allegations. There were platforms, there were data, there were all these different things. So right away, when
Just to be clear, Sean, you were on US side or Microsoft side?
So I'm the I'm at the other end of that extreme. And so over the years, and I have to say, I really fell in love with this stuff. I really started enjoying it. I really liked the consulting. I liked the issues, and I've been doing that ever since. And working in a lot of high tech industries, done a lot more work for Microsoft over the years. Worked for Intel, SAP, done a little bit of work, not for Google, but on search engine advertising, and and done a lot of work on cases involving platforms. And one of the things you kind of realize is that these sorts of issues that are inherent in sort of platform tech markets are also exist in a lot of other non-tech markets. And so platform issues are certainly something that I've been dealing with over 20 years since I've been doing this. One of the things that I was really interested in at this conference is I teach a course in competition policy here, and it's mostly US. I give a little bit of sort of part of the course to the differences between US and EU, but I really don't have that much experience in it, and so needing to prepare for this conference made me kind of spend a little time thinking about some of these issues, and I think it's going to be a learning experience for me if we're talking about sort of the US and EU issues. So,
all right, fantastic, Sean. So I think it's a great way to start our conversation. Actually, going back 20 years to the Microsoft US versus Microsoft. So I'd like you to reflect on the last 20 years and the first 10 years after the Microsoft case. Microsoft was almost broken for a year, and then we had a change of administration, didn't happen. And then reflect on the last 10 years with the rise of the digital platforms today, and tell us, where do you see, are there any real, is Sandeep onto something? There are real problems of concentration in competition and negative externalities in the US and around the world? Or you think that we're doing just great and we shouldn't be complaining?
That's a very good question. So I would say that I'm sympathetic to the idea that in some markets it's possible that certain high-tech markets in which there's a high degree of concentration, that just from a pure policy standpoint, less concentration could, in theory, be socially optimal. That think about it, he's trying to maximize some sort of social welfare function. In theory, that could be true. Where I have some concerns is, one is how you do it, okay? How you intervene to reduce concentration. In particular, the question of whether or not antitrust or competition policy enforcement is the right mechanism for which to do that. I mean, if you have, or is there some other way, some other form of regulation or something like that that's more appropriate? I tend to be concerned that antitrust enforcement is not the right way to do that. The second concern I have, which is, I went to school here and in economics department, so I have to have this concern, which is that intervention on the part of the government more generally can have adverse effects, and trying to fine-tune how competition takes place in different markets is hard to do. And if you want to think about an example, which I was thinking about when I was driving down here, is we think about the U.S. versus Microsoft case. There was a lot of allegations in that case. One of them was tying Microsoft allegedly tied Internet Explorer to Windows.
You still use allegedly 20 years after the case?
And a bunch of other contracting and vertical restraint issues. They weren't found guilty of tying, and eventually the U.S., the DOJ and Microsoft reached a series of behavioral remedy, and some of the states that were originally part of that lawsuit sued because they weren't in favor of those remedies. And one of their proposals was to require that Microsoft offer different versions of Windows with different combinations of these sort of middleware products integrated with it. So you could buy sort of a pick and choose a la carte versions of Windows. And the court in the United States rejected that policy because courts in the United States generally are reluctant to get involved in sort of how firms design their products. It's just sort of a general thing. Where in the EU, there was a similar case. It wasn't Internet Explorer, it was Windows Media Player. And the European Commission found that the bundling of Windows Media Player with Windows was an anti-competitive tie, and required that Microsoft offer a version of Windows without Windows Media Player, and because it was an illegal tie, so that was their remedy. Well, Microsoft did that, and you could buy either regular Windows or you could buy Windows without Windows Media Player. And Microsoft sold a few thousand copies of Windows without Media Player because nobody wanted it. And so it was this sort of example
By the
of...
way, not buying one was a big mistake because they've become collection items, and now they're...
Yeah, no, they are, right. But the idea, I bring this up, is it's just sort of an example of it's hard to figure out what's the right thing to do to solve the issues. And even if you believe that that was an illegal tie, trying to figure out, well, how do we fix that is difficult and not always is going to be helpful. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that there may be some competition, concentration issues, but concerned about how those issues are dealt with from an enforcement standpoint.
Sean, can you point us to specific industries or companies that you think that we should be concerned with?
I probably shouldn't say. I probably shouldn't say. I don't, none jump out at me, but even if they did, it probably wouldn't be in my interest to say that from a professional standpoint.
From which point?
From a professional
Standpoint, professional, you mean as a professor here, or professional
If
from Charles River?
If I were to, on record, say that I think there's concerns in a particular industry, then that may cause problems.
No, would they automatically hire you? No? This is just a way to get new business through the door.
I can tell you a bunch of industries where it's not an issue, because I tend to work on the defense side. Okay. So that's probably not what you want to hear.
Okay, thank you. Sandeep.
So a lot to respond to. So I think there's two ways of looking at the concentration issue. The first is, at a philosophical level, what is antitrust all about? So the dominant philosophy for about 40 years now has been consumer welfare. And consumer welfare is still not a clearly defined term. Everyone seems to have their own conception of consumer welfare, and some people will say that consumer welfare is whatever is good in the world. It doesn't include whatever is bad. So there's some conceptual vagueness to it. But if you look pre-1970s, antitrust had a much broader aim. It was about constraining corporate power, generally constraining corporate power over us as consumers, as workers, as entrepreneurs, as citizens. So the question is, how do we want to judge recent antitrust? Do we want to judge it in relation to historical purposes as expressed by Congress, or do we want to judge it by consumer welfare, a more constricted objective for antitrust? And honestly, I think by either criteria, antitrust has failed over the past 40 years. And I'll focus on consumer welfare for now. So there's growing evidence that concentration is associated with higher prices, higher markups, lower wages. And for example, our approach to corporate consolidation has been premised on a belief that two firms come together, they achieve economies of scale, they lower their costs, pass some of these lower costs through to consumers in the form of higher prices. And I think John Proca's work, he's an economist at Northeastern, has shown that merger policy has been systematically underenforced, even if you care only about short-term prices and output. And there's other work. Proca's work is by no means an outlier or unrepresentative. So there's been a couple of other studies showing that corporate consolidation leads to higher markups, doesn't generate the efficiencies that consultants for merger parties often claim and present to antitrust agencies. And so I think even if we care only about consumer welfare, we should be very concerned about how antitrust is done right now. And I would argue that there is sufficient evidence to really tighten the rules, both on mergers as well as monopolies. And unfortunately, I think antitrust has only gone further off the rails over the past 20 years. If you look at the Department of Justice's workload statistics, there was a little bit of an uptick both on the merger and monopoly front during the Clinton administration. But since then, under Bush, Obama, and now Trump, we've seen virtual inactivity when it comes to mergers and monopolies. So I think maybe the most telling fact out there is, since the year 2000, the Department of Justice has brought one monopoly case, one, at a time of high concentration, dominance in a number of industries. The DOJ seems to have made the decision not to enforce a key statute that it was entrusted to enforce. So I think even if we care only about consumer welfare, the picture right now is not pretty.
Before we continue, I want to address something. I want to ask Sean before I go to Jacques. So I was surprised, Sean, to hear that he used the word concentration. I thought you were going to push back and says this is the wrong variable, because some of your IO economist friends actually says, you know, concentrate. We want to look at competition, and if we have if we see a lot of concentration in the market, maybe this is the efficient outlet of the market, and we cannot infer anything from concentration to competition. So you did use the word concentration, and of course Sandeep uses it. So, and I'm curious to hear how do you see the relationship between concentration and competition?
Well, I just didn't want to be as confrontational as you obviously
I thought so.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree that, I mean, when I said, I definitely agree that concentration is not the right metric to use. And I think, and certainly I think that's an issue, that's one of the potential differences between the EU and the US, where I think the EU does tend to focus more on sort of the issue of market structure relative to the US, where it's more about sort of conduct and outcomes as opposed to market structure. I certainly agree with you that concentration in and of itself is not something that you ought to focus on. You ought to be focused on market outcomes. Having said that, you know, there is some evidence. I don't think it's as compelling as Sandeep says. I mean that concentration can be bad for outcome in some cases. And so that's the sense in which I'm sympathetic to the idea that you should, in theory, be concerned about it, but it ought not be the only thing that you're focusing on.
Okay, so Jacques, I would like you to address these issues, and I will add another thing. So you mentioned with
There are
your
already 55 issues, and you want to add.
okay. So what I want to ask you is, when you look at the report, and first tell us about the things that you decided that you are not going to add a maybe, that you are sure about them, and you are willing to stand in trial for that. So you told your RA, we don't need a maybe here.
There was no RA. We are poor European academics. We are not. No, it was a question. It wasn't a question of on what we would put no maybes. It's whether we would put maybe, 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 or maybe, maybe, or maybe. But on every, I think I can. In some sense, I strongly disagree with the presentation that Sean made. I think he will agree with me. In some sense, the world has changed fundamentally. I don't think we can think in the same ways as we did about antitrust for other industries. Okay? It's very, very striking. If you look in 2007, there was one kind of network firm in the top 10 firms in the world by valuation. In 2017, just 10 years later, that firm, which was Microsoft, was there, and the 7 others in the top were network firms. And we know that the economics of the digital world are very, very different from the economics of the kind of normal industries. The great tradition of economics on which antitrust was built, associated in Chicago with the names like Stigler, for instance, was a great man. But if you in European, more European tradition in general equilibrium theory, was based on the idea that markets were efficient. And we knew it, so we had some idea of what an efficient economy would be. It would be a competitive economy in which there wouldn't be too much market power. And competition policy was a way of kind of taking a hammer and beating up and rearranging the economy when this wasn't working. Competition in the normal form in which we understand it, okay, with price-taking firms, small firms, is not feasible. Okay, is not something which will happen in the digital economy. The returns to scale, big firms, it's not much more expensive to serve 20 times the number of clients you have. Network externalities, the fact that you want to belong to the same, to go to the same platforms that other people do, and the role of data, which is transferable from one activity to another, mean that you cannot have the standard rules of competition. This is just not possible. So the problem is, how do we adapt to that? How do we adapt to that world? And I don't think that we can. So the problem is that in the traditional antitrust, basically left lots of the burden of proof on competition authorities, who had to come and basically, and that was the problem with consumer welfare. In some sense, you told the competition authority, look, you have to prove, we trust generally that the world is more or less competitive. And if you see something which looks funny to you, go and prove that it is bad, because generally we know that the world works well. We don't have at all, we don't have the same intuition, the same theorems, the same economics. We don't know this. And hence I think we've got to renew the tools fundamentally, and we have to live in a world in which we don't know very well how things are working. Sorry, I'm a bit long, but I think in this framework there are two types of competition we have to be very careful. There's a competition for the market. So it's clear that we're not going to have 22 Facebooks. Okay.
Thank goodness.
The problem is, how do we make sure that Facebook is scared enough that it has some that it works for the benefits of its users? Okay. The second thing is we have lots of platforms who have lots of powers on different markets. Okay, so we've got Amazon, but we also have, the Expedias of this world, who have lots and lots of power on the hotel markets. And we also have to make sure that those platforms don't distort competition in the markets which we are regulating. And I don't think that we can think of those industries in the same terms as we are thinking of industries previously. So I will stop here. But and basically, what our report tries to do is to try to explain in which direction we should change. Okay, but of course, we don't know what the end result is because we don't know enough. The only thing we can do is say, here's the direction in which we should.
Sean, last year we had here at our Stigler conference someone that was on the other side of the Microsoft case, lawyer Gary Reback. And so Mr. Reback told us that actually he thinks that if the government was not breathing down the neck of Microsoft between 1999 to 2005, actually the outcome would be that we wouldn't have Facebook and Google. And the only reason those companies were able to thrive is because Microsoft didn't destroy them like they destroyed companies in the 90s. What do you think?
Well, we were recently involved in a case in which that was, the allegation, because we worked on a series of cases in which there were follow-ons to the DOJ case, and they kept going and kept going and kept going. And so eventually we moved up to Canada, and so the set of allegations were the same, was that Microsoft did the same bad stuff that it did in the late 90s and early 2000s, and somehow they had to tell a story of how that led to higher prices in British Columbia in 2017. And so, and there are two different sort of interpretations of what's happened since the DOJ case. The first interpretation, which was the one that we offered in that case, was that, if anything, what the evidence showed was that the DOJ's theory was wrong. Is that the DOJ had a theory that if Microsoft had allowed these forms of middleware to flourish, there would have been all these entry of operating systems into the market, and things would have been very competitive, and prices would have fallen. Well, Microsoft stopped doing all the things that it was found to have done illegally as a result of these remedies, and middleware was widely distributed, and nobody was coming up with applications to be written on the middleware, and so we didn't have this huge proliferation of competition that the DOJ theory held. That is instead, which was the story that Microsoft told in that original case, was that they faced competition from other firms for the market, that they were facing this platform-level competition, and that even though they had a large share of sales for operating systems for Windows PCs, that there were all these different possible competitive threats, and those competitive threats were constraining them, and therefore they didn't have the form of monopoly power that's traditional in a standard market. The other alternative story is the one that Mr. Reback advanced, is that no, that's not why Microsoft now faces all this competition. It faces all this competition now because of the constraints that were on it. I think the former story is more compelling because of the evidence that I said, is that all the things that the DOJ's case said didn't happen because of the conduct, eventually happened, and competition didn't flourish in the way they said. It flourished in another way, and so I would say I disagree with his theory.
So before we go to Sandeep, I want to ask Jacques a question that initially I thought I'm going to ask only later. But having seen that half of the people here in the room can't get away from their iPhones, I want to ask you about addiction and about behavioral science and about antitrust. So I have no grudge for the people who are buried in their iPhones, although an esteemed group of professionals are discussing very important issues, because I know that we're all addicted. Okay, we can't let go. Okay, right.
But it's not an iPhone.
It's not an iPhone because you're from Europe. Okay. How many people here don't have an iPhone? Oh, pretty good, pretty good. Okay. So you have Android, you have Samsungs or whatever. So the question is very simple. Do we have to take into consideration, we are now doing antitrust, we're doing policy on platforms, also not only behavioral science. Know that these companies have the ability to addict us, to manipulate us, to prey on our weaknesses, and to surveil us.
Yes and no. I mean, yes, because clearly there are some aspects which are like this. No, because you've got to be a little bit careful at one point to totally also the anarchist aspect, not to be too much, to want to manage the world. So sometimes you have things that people are not aware of prices and of the quality, and the government should come and intervene. But if people are not aware of quality, how are they aware of the quality of food? Are they aware of the quality of the cars? So yes, you should take it into account. The doubts I have is once in a while, people seem to say, I mean, especially in Europe, you get people who seem to say that people don't have any free will at all and are totally taken, and I think this is not disrespectful. But no, certainly, I mean, you need to take into account all the sciences you need to take into account. I mean, you need to take into account data science, you need to account psychology, and so on when you're doing antitrust. I don't really understand the question.
The question is that some people think that those companies, unlike any other companies, since they have very intimate connections with us as consumers, and they can prey on our weaknesses in a way, unprecedented ways, more than the tobacco companies. Okay, they just addicted us to nicotine. They can do a lot of things because they monitor us all the time, because they are monopolies and so on. And it means that when we're thinking about the kind of regulation we need to put, if we need to put any regulation, we should be cognizant of that. That's the question.
No, but that point is in some way different. This point would arise even without the behavioral aspect.
Okay.
Because the fact that people can check on you and know what you are doing and only provide.
And I added to it also the behavioral aspect.
So of course we should take into account the behavioral aspect. But in the 60s you had books which explained to you how advertising manipulated people. I mean the behavioral aspects have been there for a very, very long time. So I'm not sure that they're very much more pregnant now than they were 20 years ago. My grandchildren are not more addicted, and not less, to their video games than my children were when they were playing.
The video games today are way different than the video games of 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, but they were still addicted.
Yeah. Okay, Sandeep?
I can attest to that. So, no problem.
So I think behavioral economics and behavioral science certainly inform antitrust, consumer protection, and other forms of policy making. And when I was at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, I think we were notable for using behavioral economics in a way that other regulators like the Fed and the FTC were not and are not. So I certainly agree. I think behavioral economics offers a more realistic, accurate picture of human behavior and constraints on human decision making that neoclassical Homo economicus doesn't capture. But I think behavioral economics is a somewhat secondary issue here. I think it really goes down to a question of power and the fact that we can't escape Google or Facebook in today's society if we want to be fully functioning members of American or European society. And this unavoidability gives Google and Facebook extraordinary power over us to collect large troves of data on every little and big thing that we do. And so I think the power issue has to be front and center. And for sure, I think the present configuration of rules has allowed these companies to prey on human frailties, but I think addressing the power and their dominance, whether it's in search or social media, I think that's the core issue that has to be addressed.
Okay, so let's see what the audience thinks. So, how many of you are able to avoid Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp? We have 3 people. How many of you are able to avoid Google? Here is the DuckDuckGo user. I've been looking for you, sir. Okay, and now I'll ask you another question. So when you look at the relationship that you have with Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Google, would you say that you are content with this relationship, that you get, they surveil you all the time and they know everything that you're doing, whether you are on the app or off the app, because they have millions of other websites that they monitor, and they know all your activity because you are able to get targeted advertising. And it sounds like a good deal. Who thinks it's a good deal? Jacques, what do you think? You have a...
No, I think it's obvious. I mean, it depends what you call a good deal. I mean, could we get a better deal? Yes.
They're not happy. They're telling you they were not happy. We want to see some change in the relationship between us and the platforms.
But
I
the
think
problem
that's
is
reading a lot into their response.
the problem is which change. I mean, I also found that the food was not very good on the plane yesterday, and so I would have liked better food. But this
Sandeep will tell you that there will be an airline consolidation, and that explains the food on the airlines.
but
We had 9 airlines that serve gourmet food.
Like in the good old days.
No, but I mean, think about the phone. I mean, since I was a kid, and that was a long time ago, we've been dreaming and seeing movies in which people were communicating at video telephone. Okay, that was really the dream in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and so on. Now, for the last year, okay, when I speak to my children, it's always on a video phone, and basically it's using either WhatsApp or Skype. For the last, and the thing which is really amazing here is that the telcos, which control the heart of the system, have not been able to put this in place, and have let themselves be overtaken by those kind of new something like WhatsApp, which didn't exist 10 years ago, in order to do something for which clearly there is a big demand, because now people, when they use their iPhone down the street, are looking at the people to whom they're speaking. So, it's easy to say we are not happy, but the changes have been really extraordinary. I mean, people can listen to very good music, basically for free, or for very, very little, all the time. And that's really important, because speaking about music, I mean, you've got, I carry 50, 100 books on my phone. The changes have been extremely important, and I think we should celebrate them. I think it's wrong to go around saying, oh, things are not doing well. I mean, they could be better. We need to control them more. Okay, but kind of saying,
So it's a generational thing. They should be happy, but they are millennials. John, you want to weigh in?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a good friend of mine who's in advertising, and he says that within the field there's a sort of generally recognized sort of generational divide where millennials and younger people are okay generally with the sort of targeted advertising. They want the stuff that's being sent to them to be more efficient, to be the stuff that they're interested in, and they don't view the privacy concerns that kind of advertising raises to the same extent that people my age do, because we grew up in a world where that wasn't possible. So I don't have it. It's not my area of expertise. I'm not, a privacy specialist or anything like that. I think there's some legitimate.
There is no privacy.
Yeah.
You don't need to be.
And so I recognize that there are some potential concerns with the possibility that some companies may have too much information on us and can use that for harm. I think, as Jacques was saying, they can use it for good as well. I have been to a variety of different conferences in which the issue of whether or not there's an intersection between privacy and antitrust, and I have never heard anybody articulate clearly that that's the case. So I think, from my perspective at least, I think whatever issues you think there are about privacy in big data, I think that they're really distinct from competition policy issues.
If I could say, our report has a nicely written section. I didn't write, I did generate on this, on the relationship between the GDPR and competition policy. Well, clearly, there's a very strong connection at some point.
So GDPR promotes competition or inhibits competition? It depends.
I'm an economist, on one hand, on the other hand. Probably the microphone.
That's why we have you a microphone, so you can't do the trick.
No, but the problem is that so one of the intersections, for instance, is the GDPR says that data subjects from the GDPR, called data subject, should not be forced to give their data. The data has to be freely given. And we don't really know what the freely is in the GDPR. So in particular, if a firm tells you you can have this or that service, but in exchange I would like to know what's your favorite ice cream and your date of birth, I don't need that data to give you the service, but I would need to use that data to make money. But the firm is not forcing you. Is that freely given or not freely given? Okay, and depending on the way you think about the term free, it can be one or the other. But there is strong suspicion that the courts will interpret this as saying that a dominant firm, a firm which has got a monopoly power, will not be allowed to ask you that question, because then you wouldn't be free. It's the only one offering the service. So you wouldn't be free not to give or not. And a firm which is which faces competition will be allowed to ask you the question, because you will be free to go to another one. So we have quite a few intersections of that type. Others are more technical, which are considered.
All right, so the name of this panel, I want to remind you, and remind myself actually, is EU versus United States. So don't go, you are the EU. So the question is very...
There's no disagreement within the United States.
That's true, that's true. Each one of them thought that you were going to back him. And it's not clear who are you backing at this point.
I said I'm a centrist.
So who's doing a better work? Better job? Antitrust enforcers, the EU or the people in the US? Sean? They are not your clients, no,
Yeah,
your future
no,
clients.
I do think on a lot of dimensions that EU competition policy is misguided in some ways. I think probably the area that, from my standpoint, is the biggest concern and where they really got it wrong is the issue of sort of information sharing. There's a sort of an academic and legal debate regarding to what extent sharing of information amongst firms should constitute collusion, a violation of U.S. and EU antitrust laws. And in the European Union the European Commission, has taken a much more negative view towards the effects of sharing information amongst firms, and viewing that much more likely to have adverse effects on competition, and therefore should be violation of the antitrust laws, where here in the United States, information sharing in and of itself doesn't constitute sort of an illegal agreement. It can be under certain situations, but there's differences in approaches there. So that's certainly, I think, one area where I think the EU has got it wrong, and with respect to competition policy. And I think the other area, I think, where I think the European Commission has it wrong, is I think I may have alluded to this earlier, they tend to be much more sort of outcome and market structure focused, and focusing too much on what the appropriate market structure should be relative to is there competition, are prices low, is innovation high, is consumption, is output large, and I think that's one area where I think the European Commission has placed too much emphasis. I remember, for example, when the Court of First Instance, I think this is when it happened, the Court of First Instance denied Microsoft's appeal in the case of that, which I repeatedly talked about now. And the commissioner was asked, well, what do you think of this outcome, or something along the lines of, well, what do you think Microsoft's share should be? And she said 50%. And so the idea was that, this, I think for me, to sort of crystallize this notion that in the European Commission, the idea is we want to focus on a market structure. The market structure is Microsoft shouldn't be too big, as opposed to thinking about what's the conduct that has gotten them to be in the position where they are. Have there been benefits to it? And which I think is much more the emphasis in U.S. antitrust enforcement. So those are the areas where I think the U.S. has got it right.
Sandeep?
So I think the Europeans have been much closer to getting it right than the U.S. Probably the answer you expected from me. And I think the European approach has generally been much more consistent with basic norms of the rule of law. As Jacques alluded to earlier, in Europe, the European Commission and some of the member states recognize that if you're a dominant firm, you have special power. You can exclude rivals in a way that non-dominant firms can't. So in the Android decision last summer, the European Commission said Google broke European competition law by engaging in tying and exclusive dealing, effectively using its existing dominance to cement its dominance going forward. And what's interesting is that those two counts specifically, the tying counts and the exclusive dealing counts, fit quite comfortably within existing US antitrust precedent. In fact, the FTC has brought, I believe, about a half dozen, maybe even a dozen exclusive dealing cases over the past 8 years. Of course, none of these cases involve big tech. So I think the problem in the United States has become, and once again, alluding to something Jacques said earlier, this almost conclusive presumption that exclusionary conduct, even when done by a dominant firm, is likely beneficial, pro-competitive. There's no real empirical evidence to support that idea. It's just a series of hypotheses dating back to the 1970s saying that exclusive dealing, tying, refusals to deal could have theoretical benefits. Therefore, the government and other plaintiffs should face an extraordinary burden of proof in court. I think the Europeans got it right. They said, no, actually for dominant firms, they can engage in these practices, but they better have a really good story for why they engage in exclusive dealing and tying. So in the Google case, Google had multiple years to explain to the European Commission why its practices were generating consumer benefits, and they didn't meet their burden. So I will say, I think I have some issues with the European approach to remedies. I think some of the fines, especially for the very large companies, have become almost like a cost of doing business. They pay the fine, continue on their merry way. And I think the Europeans should seriously start looking at structural remedies to address the dominant problems in assorted markets once and for all, instead of going after these companies every few years and imposing a glorified parking ticket on them.
All right. So Jacques, you have the casting vote and you cannot abstain.
I love those fines. I mean, you know, they reduce my taxes. Well, on this case, I'm closer to Sandeep. I think, you know, take another example. Take in the gig economy, what we call the gig economy. It's very easy to imagine that firm tells the suppliers of service, makes it difficult for the suppliers of service to multi-home to compete, you know, so for instance, I don't know if they do it, but for instance, a ride-sharing company could make it difficult for its drivers to at the same time be connected to another ride-sharing. Should we say this is illegal unless you can prove that you've got a very good reason to do it? Or should we say that the competition authority have to prove every specific case that indeed there was a loss of consumer welfare in order by this prevention of multi-homing? I think the second solution puts much too much of a burden on the competition authorities. The platforms are the one who are putting those rules in place. At the time at which they put those rules in place, they can think about, no, well, is it a good thing or not? And you know, and in this case, but I'm not thinking of this as I'm thinking in terms of the structure of the market. I'm thinking of this in terms of thinking of consumer welfare, but it's so complicated to compute the long-run consumer welfare that if we always say, oh, you have to really identify the consumer welfare loss, we are forcing the competition authorities to take very short-run views. So in some sense, we should look at the structure of the market, but not because the structure of the market is a good thing in itself, but that's where we may disagree. But because the structure of the market is very often a very good indicator which enables us to do a competition policy in a more efficient way.
Okay. So before we go to, yeah.
Could I respond
Sure.
very quickly to the market structure point? It's true, we could have different outcomes. We could focus on market structure, we could focus on prices, we could focus on the level of innovation. But at least in the United States, this question has been resolved quite clearly by Congress. If you look at the legislative histories of the Sherman and especially the Clayton Act, Congress wanted to protect decentralized marketplaces. So I don't think it's our role as lawyers and economists to say that, well, we think Congress got it wrong, we would advance a different objective. We weren't elected to make those choices, so I think we should defer to the legislative decisions that were made.
Well, I would, let me just add on that point that, you know, the Sherman and Clayton Act, particularly the Sherman Act, it was left up to the courts to enforce it. And so, you know, there's been 100 plus years of law on the Sherman Act and what constitutes, you know, illegal conduct under that act. And so, you know, it's the courts are the ones that have basically, if you think about outside the context of specific agency enforcement, you know, most of the enforcement that takes place in the United States is by private parties, and most of that enforcement is the rules about what constitutes illegal and legal conduct with respect to competition are determined by the courts.
Yeah, but Sean, the courts changed the way they interpret the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act in the last 50 years quite significantly.
Oh yeah, I would agree with that, and I think and I think for the most part it's been based on evolving in the way economists typically understand.
Yeah. So this would be my last question before we take questions from the audience. So last week we had here at the law school a conference with the unusual name of "Do we need to rethink Chicago School?" Because as we all know, there is an elephant here in this room, and the elephant is that Chicago was probably the most influential intellectual force in shaping antitrust in the United States and maybe in other countries in the last 30 or 40 years. So here is the question that I pose to you. Should we rethink Chicago School when it comes to antitrust? Jacques?
I mean, no, I don't care whether the Chicago School has got it right or wrong. You know, Chicago School is first absolutely gorgeous and beautiful economics, and they should keep on doing this. Okay. Now, then the issue is whether or not you have to believe all the conclusions. And clearly, you know what? I mean, the Chicago School has become, how do you say that? A whipping boy in antitrust for the one monopoly thesis, which now has been proved to be, we know is wrong. We know it's also wrong in the case of platforms. All the modern research on two-sided platforms, which looks at studies the rules they impose for interactions on the platforms, has shown that the platforms with monopoly power will not integrate.
Self-correct.
But no, will self-correct, but for their own benefit, and won't come to socially efficient outcomes. So for one example, which is very striking outside of the digital world, is when you go to a shopping mall, it's very difficult to find the store you want to go to. I wanted to buy shoes today. Finding the Echo store was not that obvious. You know, you go around and so on, and we know that indeed this is a way by which the shopping center can, in some sense, sell monopoly power. So clearly, the Chicago School, in the sense of the policy, there is nothing to be looked at. I mean, I think we all agree is wrong, but it doesn't mean that please Chicago stay Chicago. That's a great thing in the world.
Sandeep.
Yes, we should absolutely overthrow the Chicago School of Antitrust. So the first reason I think is it's built on a lie. And this lie is Robert Bork's interpretation of legislative intent in the Sherman Act. He claimed to have studied the legislative histories and concluded that the Sherman Act is about promoting consumer welfare. And this is bogus history. It's been discredited by a number of legal academics and historians. But when he wrote this in the 1970s, the Supreme Court was being remade by the Nixon administration, and Richard Nixon appointed a number of justices who were ideologically sympathetic and indeed aligned with Robert Bork. So they took Bork's bogus history and ran with it and said, ah yes, despite what we said 2 years earlier, we've discovered Robert Bork, and now antitrust is a consumer welfare prescription. The Supreme Court said that in 1979. So the Chicago School is built on a false reading, whether by design or not, that's a different question, of congressional intent here. So it's a deeply undemocratic project from the very beginning. So I think that's one reason that's the fundamental reason for rejecting it. But I think a second and important reason is the economics are bad. It's really, I was reading Bork recently, and you can say that thinking in antitrust has evolved since Bork wrote his landmark work, The Antitrust Paradox, but it hasn't, at least not beyond the margins. And Bork's analysis is really just a pyramid of assumptions, and he offers very little empirical support for anything in there. He just says, well, by deductive reasoning, I believe these mergers are desirable, these exclusionary practices are desirable, but there's a dearth of empirical evidence, and the Chicago School really hasn't built up that empirical evidence in the past 4 decades. So now we're starting to see both IO scholars as well as labor economists study different markets, for example, labor markets, hospital markets, and find that the approach to antitrust in these cases has been profoundly wrong. Concentration has led to higher prices, lower wages, despite Bork's confident pronouncements. So I think we should reject the Chicago School because it's bad history and it's bad economics.
Sean, you are left with the
Yeah,
important...
wait, that means close the law school, but keep the economics department.
and Harris. This is Harris, the last school
I guess
there.
it's somewhere in between.
Yeah, so I have a different, as an economist, what I call the Chicago School and its impact on the law is very different from limiting to just Bork. I mean, there was a number of important economic ideas that were advanced by economists in both the law, by lawyers and
No, when I said, just to be clear, when I said Chicago School, I meant antitrust. I didn't mean the...
Yes, no, I understand that. But I mean, there have been a lot of ideas, antitrust ideas, by people in the law school, by people in the economics department that long preceded Borg. And when I think about what their contribution has been to the law, it has been to really fundamentally change how the law looks at the conduct. And it's really forced that the courts to say, okay, there's some policy which, like exclusive dealing, which you would think on the face of it would be obviously something that you shouldn't allow. Why should you allow firms to have exclusive dealing? Well, one of the things that the Chicago School did and the people did was to say, well, there can be good reasons for that. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean that you always want to say that exclusive dealing can never be a problem. But what it's forced courts to do is to recognize that when we want to think about these issues, we want to think about the economics of the conduct. And that's a tradition which is embedded now in law, particularly antitrust law, and that's not going away. I mean, and that is largely a Chicago School contribution. And so I agree that some of the simple early models that were used to develop these points have been shown to be not particularly robust, but still they're very powerful ideas that have been used by courts to think about some of these issues. And so it's never going away because it's just now enshrined in antitrust law and antitrust practice. I will add one thing to Sandeep's comment about sort of the lack of evidence that these types of practices can have pro-competitive effects. That in the practice of an antitrust case involving conduct like exclusive dealing or tying or bundling, one of the things that happens in those types of cases is that the experts that work for these different sides have to present evidence on the effects of these conduct. Okay? So in every one of these cases, somebody is, for the plaintiffs, is always saying, look, exclusive dealing has led to higher prices and it's led to reduced output. Well, at the same time, the experts that's working for the defendants is saying just the opposite and looking at the evidence and saying, look, you see that when these firms started doing this practice, output went up or prices went down or things like that. And so it's simply not true that there's no analysis, no evidence that these kinds of practices can be beneficial, because it's just a part of every case in which these allegations come up.
Before we go to the Sandeep, you just have to give us credit for one thing. You keep criticizing us and we keep inviting you here. Okay? To Chicago.
I like the new Chicago School.
What?
I like the new Chicago School.
The new Chicago School. Okay. So let's now use the... let's take some... I see Anat is really wants... Professor Otmati for Stanford, please. Yeah.
One reason I looked at my iPhone is to check the title of this panel, and it wasn't just on antitrust. It said regulating tech, big tech. So I want to turn to other regulation, and actually Sandeep comes from CFPB, and so I want to talk about some things related to consumer protection as well as other forms of tying, so which have to do also with the European law. So both my original exposure to policy was in the context of finance and banking, and in banking, one of the things is about mixing commerce and banking and certain separations. A bank can't have a travel agency, but now a search company can have a travel agency, and we know that Google can really kill companies by putting them wherever it decides to put them, and that's the secret sauce of the algorithm. We don't know, but now that Google has become Alphabet and has much more businesses and it is dominant in search, there is that question of dominating more and more areas, and certainly that's true for Amazon, which was not mentioned so far in terms of its control of commerce. So that's area number one, and just I'll speak just for a minute about consumer. in terms of service. We all lie all the time because we always say I've read and understood, and we haven't read and haven't understood, and if we did, we might sign away our kids, or all these experiments that were done about how we don't read, and it's known that we don't read. Now, the terms of service are really basically coercive contracts, and are adhesive and are not, should not be allowed. And that's a rule you can make independent and part of the reason we agree is we have no choice. It's not a real consent. These are not real contracts that we can negotiate. So there is no negotiation. So there are a lot of very simple things that, in the spirit of trying to come to some agreement on something here, maybe we can on a few of these practices that really don't feel right instinctively and somebody should read them for everybody else and decide that they make sense or not, and to subject millions of people to having to click. And then there are a few other things that some lawmakers here have become concerned about: dark patterns, all kinds of ways in and never out. There's a video I recommend to people to view what it takes to sign off Amazon. It is very, very, very difficult. It would take you.
Why would you want to sign off?
It's just as an exercise of dark patterns, where you sort of the Roach Motel, what they call, where you get in and never out. So it's very hard to find how to sign out, and even when you find it, which takes quite a lot of creativity, you cannot actually sign off. You have to talk to somebody, and then they have to. So you really have to want to do it. And I don't know why you would, but maybe there's a few that might. But as a general rule, there are other things about psychology, about clicking green buttons, and then the button takes you to buy something after they trained you to click green. All kinds of other things like that are in the marketing area. But anyway,
You're from Stanford.
I'm from Stanford.
Just making sure.
Anyway, so both the tying of sort of different basic search or something very basic to commerce and sort of being able to control competition in other sectors, as well as consumer deception and tying and other things like that maybe are small ways to make progress.
Anyone want to respond? A lot of
Yeah, I'll take the first
okay.
stab. That great comment. So I think it's absolutely true that the antitrust regulators, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, have allowed companies, Google and Facebook are good illustrations, that already had dominance in a particular market to buy companies in adjacent markets and really extend their dominance. So in the case of Google, buying YouTube, and in the case of Facebook, buying Instagram and WhatsApp, and extinguishing some very promising competitors. So when you have companies already enjoying dominance in one market, I think we should have effectively a per se ban on further acquisitions, because the risk of monopoly leveraging and marginalization of rivals in adjacent markets is very, very high. And I think it's worth remembering that the Clayton Act, which is the principal anti-merger statute of the United States, is about protecting decentralized markets and stopping mergers that even threaten to reduce competition. And a number of commentators in 2012 and 2014 were asking, I was not among these commentators, I can't take credit for this, what's the FTC doing? Why isn't it recognizing that Instagram is probably the most potent threat to Facebook's dominance? And I guess the FTC issued a second request, did some poking around, but ultimately cleared the deal. So I think the evolution of the tech sector, among other things, underscores the importance of strong merger policy. And as to the question of contracts, I completely agree. I think it's really meaningless to speak about consent when it comes to standard form contracts, or as lawyers commonly call them, contracts of adhesion. And it's not because we are dumb or irrational. We simply don't have the time to review every page of the terms of service. So I think a fascinating finding I read recently is, if we just read all the privacy policies we agreed to, we'd spend something like 200 hours reviewing these documents. That's just one type of, that's one term of service. So if we actually spend time reviewing all the terms of service, we wouldn't have time to do anything else in our lives. So for a lot of these terms, whether it's arbitration or forum selection clauses, we just need Congress or regulators to ban them and prevent prevent companies from really exploiting our, I think, quite rational ignorance.
Sean was appalled when you say ban M&As.
Well, yeah, no, I was appalled by the per se claim that tech companies should never be able to acquire other tech companies. But I was responding to the first one. I think that the concerns are legitimate. There's tying law, and there are ways in which agencies and private companies can bring tying cases against dominant tech companies that expand into other areas. And so I think that that's potentially a concern. That's legitimate. It's not just big tech companies; it's other companies. And so tying law is appropriate for dealing with those issues. I think on the second point, I think it's also a legitimate concern. I think regulation is the right way to do it rather than antitrust law. I agree that it's potentially easier for a company that has more market power to be able to sort of force people to accept these terms, but still, it's a regulation issue, not an antitrust. You don't break up a company and
Yeah, I'm not saying it's
Regulate
not
the
an
practices.
right, yeah. So I agree with you that it's an issue, but it's a regulatory issue.
That's what I presented it.
Any more questions? Okay.
Just one point here, because I think there's a really interesting research project which I think I think you're right. We are not speaking about regulation, but in some sense, if you take regulation broadly construed, we've got lots of tools. We've got competition policy, we've got traditional regulation, we've got consumer protection, and so privacy regulation, and so on. Now, over the years, those different types of regulation have kind of, taken each have developed some competence, and have developed boundaries, and have developed areas of concern. And I do think that the world is becoming different enough that it's time to change those boundaries. But we don't know how to do that. And I've seen very, very little regulation thinking about this. And I think we don't have a very good theoretical definition of what's the difference between competition policy and regulation. And hence it's very, very difficult for us to think in a disciplined way about those issues. But I think you're pointing to really important issues, and there are really important topics there to think about.
Thank you. I have two questions on the political economy of antitrust. So the first one is that some people argue that the European Commission is tougher on big tech because there are no European big tech companies. So my first question is the American regulator, is the American Congress captured by big tech? And the second question is related to the Chicago School debate. So I would argue that one of the main political ideas of Milton Friedman was that markets and competition are a means to prevent anyone in a democracy from gathering too much power. And now we see that in the digital economy, the big players can have a lot of political power, not only because they can lobby, but because they have to play a role in freedom of speech, privacy, and so on. So my second question is, should political arguments be made in an antitrust case? Thank you.
Well, I got the microphone, so.
While we are fighting for the microphone.
So I have a funny story to tell about the issue of EU and US, EU enforcement of antitrust policy against US companies. I was at a conference that was supposed to be, it was in 2007, it was supposed to be the end of the Microsoft case, because it ended with a 5-year consent decree, and so this conference was designed around that particular thing. And it was at Northwestern, and what happened right before the conference was that consent decree period got extended another 5 years. So, bad title for a conference because it wasn't over. But right before the conference started, when the court of first instance came out with its ruling opposing Microsoft's appeal of the fine and the judgment. And so a big part of the conference was people talking about the differences between EU and antitrust and U.S. antitrust law and the court of first instance opinion and all that stuff like that. And Daniel Spoler was at Northwestern. Daniel Spoler gets up there and he says, you know, I think this debate really kind of takes too seriously the idea that the court of first instance took its job seriously. He said, basically, my view, this was just a protectionist measure. That it was basically the EU going after a US company, and so I don't necessarily completely agree with it, but I think if you look at this, there's certainly some idea that it's easier for the EU to take a more aggressive stance towards Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Intel, because they're all US companies as opposed to EU companies. And then I have nothing to say about the political economy because I know nothing about it. So I'll let Sandeep.
Yeah. So I think the EU's engaging in protectionism argument would have some merit if the European Commission weren't enforcing the abuse of dominance standard on European companies. But it has. There are a number of cases that the European Commission has brought against German, French, other companies. And in a lot of these big tech cases, principal complainants have been other US companies. So it's not marginalized or defeated European rivals that have been complaining about Google or Intel. It's been Microsoft and AMD. So excluded American companies have actually gone to Europe and pitched their cases over there because they believe the European Commission takes its statutory mandates much more seriously than its American counterparts do. So I don't think the protectionism argument really fits with the facts. And I do think there is a good case to be made on this side of the Atlantic, though, that there has been some capture of the antitrust agencies. I don't know if regulatory capture is it. I think it's more ideological capture, especially during, it continues, and certainly the public statements of the head of the antitrust division suggest someone who's extremely deferential to the tech industry and even willing to intervene in cases to help the tech industry. So for example, the Department of Justice filed a brief in the Apple versus Pepper case in support of Apple. Thankfully, the Supreme Court came out the right way in that decision. A nice opinion yesterday. And going back to the Obama administration, there was really a revolving door between not only the FTC, but other federal agencies and big tech. Big tech was seen as sort of socially acceptable dominant firms. It might be not kosher for an official to go from Treasury to a big bank or from the FCC to Comcast, but it was seen as perfectly acceptable and even good for someone to go from the FTC to Google or Facebook or Amazon. And in fact, a number of high-ranking Obama administration officials now occupying senior positions at Uber and Amazon. So I think ideological capture was and is an issue. And on the political economy question, I'm generally very opposed to this idea of courts and regulators measuring benefits and costs on a case-by-case basis. I think they're really engaging in a fool's errand. We're asking them to quantify social costs and benefits, often things that are completely unlike, and then come to some judgment on whether a particular merger or particular practice is beneficial. So my vision for a workable, effective antitrust system that preserves decentralized market structures where possible is one that just has simple, straightforward rules, somewhat like what the European Commission does on abuse of dominance. So I don't favor case-by-case balancing. I mean, just to make a put a finer point on it, like how do you measure enhanced political power versus increased productive efficiencies? It's completely unworkable.
I wanted to ask another about content moderation, and basically, what are the fundamental differences in how European regulators have approached that issue and here, and if you see any possible, reconsideration, reframing of, something like the Communications Decency Act or even the First Amendment or something like that.
Repealing section 230?
Yeah.
Anyone wants to address the questions of the platforms that no liability on the content? Thanks.
Freedom of speech.
Maybe
Repealing
Professor.
section 230.
That's for a lawyer.
I haven't studied this issue all that closely. As a general matter, I'm very skeptical of entrusting speech control to Google and Facebook. So I think
That's too late.
it's too late. But I think that just shows the importance of trying to create competitors to these companies. And maybe, as Guy said, maybe the horse is left the bar.
So I'm neither a lawyer, but just to say a few words. We have 4 committees that are proposing in the conference that starts tomorrow. They're proposing the policy recommendations, and 2 of the committees had to, including the committee that I chaired on the news media, had to look at the question of repealing of section 230. So eventually we decided that we don't want to repeal it, but what we might want to do is say that platforms who enjoy section 230, and it's estimated that there is a hidden subsidy here of a substantial sum, have to obey by a certain specific regulation. We need to understand more what are they doing and how they are prioritizing content, and what efforts they are doing to prioritize content if they want to continue to benefit from this subsidy.
I want to build on what the young lady in the front row talked about a little earlier. The Google, when we talk about it, we tend to talk about all the GDPR, we tend to talk about all these consumer issues, but the real elephant in the room is, with their monopoly power, they can put other companies out of business, and there's no transparency on it. Their click fraud is rampant. They tell you how many clicks you have. You have no way to audit that. You have no way of knowing what that. If I have a business and she has a business, and they don't like one of our political views, they could charge one of us 10 cents for the clicks and the other one $10. We have a situation where the #1 emerging corporate governance issue for all companies on Earth is Google's unchecked monopoly power, and that's not just a U.S. government antitrust thing. That's a competitive situation that the world's never really seen. Their prices are skyrocketing. They keep filling the SERP with more ads. They're doing all these other things, and the world is focusing on these little minutia sideshow things. And one day you wake up and your community's empty because there's no companies left. And that's where we're going. And I don't see the mechanism that undoes this, because everybody's so ignorant about it, and the press can't even talk about the right issues. For example, Uber, should have never been an IPO. The stock market, I knew when I worked.
You told us that last week.
No, I actually did talk about it, online, and I tweeted some articles that said that. But the bottom line is they're paying 30 cents to Apple and Google, so they're fine with it for now. But they could turn off the company with one click because it's on their app platform.
Any of the
So
young want to react.
What has to happen to deal with Google's unchecked monopoly power in B2B? Because that's the real issue. Everything else is a sideshow and secondary.
Yeah, well said. I think Google really has this online bottleneck and can make or break literally millions of businesses around the world by either delisting them from from the first page, or otherwise marginalizing them relative to preferred businesses. And that's the core issue. You're absolutely right. And I actually have a somewhat personal example here from a couple of years ago that illustrates Google's really governmental power. So when I was at CFPB, my main project, this ran for 2+ years, was to help develop regulations for the payday lending industry. And I'm no fan of this industry. I think it's horribly exploitative and predatory. And in mid-2016, Google made a very public announcement that they would no longer feature ads for payday and title loans. And everyone's first reaction was, wow, Google's such a socially responsible company. And that was my first reaction too, but then when I sat down and thought about it, one thing if Congress or my former employer decided to make this decision to disappear the payday loan industry, we're publicly accountable, we're directly or indirectly working for all Americans, but Google shouldn't have the right to decide what financial products Americans see. That's exercising fundamental governmental power, and I don't think most of my colleagues saw it that way just because
They hated payday
they
loans
hated
more than they
payday.
hated Google.
Exactly, and it's like, okay, this is a socially responsible actor, and yeah, maybe it shouldn't be making this decision, but exercising his power wisely.
We have this lady that.
There were two very notable failed tech transactions last year, the failed takeover of Broadcom for Qualcomm and then Qualcomm's failed takeover of NXP. In both cases, there was government action or inaction that made the deal did not happen. Curious to see if any of you think the right thing happened in any of those cases.
This is security issues, not monopoly power. Sean?
You know, I mean, I'm not that familiar with those merger specific questions about why they rejected those mergers. I know that there has been a lot of concerns about Qualcomm's licensing practices more generally, and so I believe, and I'm not 100% certain, that there may have been some concerns with the antitrust enforcement agencies to say if we allow them to merge with some other companies, that will allow them to extend those licensing practices. You know, I can't say necessarily that they got it right, but if I know that there are some concerns about Qualcomm and its practices, and if that was the reason that they rejected those mergers, then I think they potentially could have gotten it right.
A more general point on this, if I may. I mean, the standard antitrust practice is to say firms know what they are doing, so let them merge, and then the government has to prove that there is something which is that it increases monopoly power and it's bad for consumer welfare, to forbid it. Again, I think this is one of the areas where I feel relatively comfortable with a change in the burden of proof and with asking for more, proof that there are indeed deficiencies. I mean, if you take the Time Warner, AT&T merger, thank you. The judge takes it for granted that the merger is going to allow Time Warner to have data about what is how much people watch the same kind of data that Netflix gets, because Netflix is more integrated. There doesn't seem to have been any discussion of whether or not this could have been done through contractual means rather than a merger. And I think that on all those things, there could be really a tightening up of the standards.
Gentlemen here.
Hi. Do you think that the antitrust division in DOJ or the European Commission is understaffed or underfunded? And do you think that, should, let's say, funding them appropriately or staffing them appropriately should be the first most essential step in trying to?
Sean, do you think that Charles River is underfunded?
More cases, more cases, more cases. I do know that they are understaffed. I know that from work, I don't do a lot of merger work, but I know that talking to people that work in mergers, like, why did this one go through? And it's kind of like, well, we just didn't have the people to give it the proper attention. So I do think certainly in the merger space they could use more staff. I think one of the things that's really different about the EU and the US is in terms of sort of the unilateral practices part. I mean, they're clearly not. I mean, primary enforcement is private action, and there's a huge plaintiffs bar, and there's no concern that there aren't enough plaintiffs lawyers out there bringing cases because they're huge, they're really wealthy, and they're very good lawyers, and they're good economists, and so I think with respect to the EU, I think it's a different story. They're just getting started with more private action, and so it's likely to be a bigger issue there about understaffing of the agencies.
I think the same thing is true. One thing I just like to say, which is a little bit parallel to this, is that I've been really impressed by the people at the DG Camp at the EU. I mean, so they don't do anything perfectly. There's some areas on which I think that it's like any organization, but they're really dedicated, and I mean it's amazing to see the amount of work they do and so on. And sometimes feel very, very underpowered compared to the companies and so on. So there's a little bit of a feeling of paranoia in those institutions, but I think overall it's really good people who work there. I mean, they could sometimes do a better job. It's impressive.
So I have two quick questions. One is if you compare Google to other existing search engines, be it Yahoo, Bing, DuckDuckGo, all of which I've used at different times, there is absolutely no comparison in the quality of searches. Google is far, far, far ahead. So the first question is there an argument to be made that breaking up Google for whatever good reasons will reduce the quality of services offered by it and nobody else will be able to compete? So overall there'll be a huge reduction in consumer welfare, which Google is currently providing. And the same argument could be made for Amazon, Facebook, etc. The second question is, there was an article recently in New York Times that said, by the Facebook co-founder, which said that it is time to break Facebook up. And there were certain opposing arguments made on Twitter and elsewhere, which said that even if this was to be done, Facebook already has about 2.5 billion consumers. And even with two different Facebooks with 250 million consumers each, it would not really reduce its consumer power at all. And it would just continue. I mean, each of those companies would evolve into different Facebooks, and we would have two Facebooks instead of one, because that is just the nature of the industry and how the profits are made.
So, by the way, Chris Hughes, the co-founder of Facebook, wrote that op-ed in the New York Times. Will be tomorrow at our conference. He's going to be a keynote speaker at the. Okay, you can all see it online because the conference is over. So, yes, you want to address the.
Well, first, DuckDuckGo buys its search from, I don't remember if it's Bing or Google. So you've got to be a little bit careful when you are comparing search engines, because as far as I understand, there are only really two of them, and then the others are maybe. I mean, if you broke up Google, okay, I'm not. What do you mean breaking up? You can't break the search engine. So you would break the search engine from the rest of Alphabet. I'm not for, this is neutral and for and against. I don't see why to change very much the incentives of Google in terms of the quality of the search engine, whether it was alone or with the others.
Yeah, I would say I think that if you believe there are scale economies in search, which I think most people do, then making Google smaller would reduce the quality of searches.
But what do you mean by making it smaller?
Well, I guess that's a good point, right? If you
so what you could do is you could forbid it in Europe.
Right.
And you could say Europeans a bit like the Chinese.
Or the Russians.
Well, you could imagine a policy which said, you can only get a certain number of searches, right? That, after a certain number of people have searched, then you've got to use, or maybe you could imagine a situation where you had to give another engine, your algorithm, or your results, or something like that. So you can imagine a situation.
You can buy it.
Sean, Jacques, why do you think that Google pays Apple every year $10 billion to make sure that Google search is the default on the iPhone?
Why do I think they do it?
Yeah.
Because they get a lot of money from
But if
Apple.
Google is the best product out there, why would they care that they have to be default and pay $10 billion a year?
I don't think it's 10.
It's 9. We don't really know the number. Analysts estimate it anywhere between 8 or 12 or something like
Yeah,
that.
that's
Right,
what the
Sandeep?
reports have said, but it's never been disclosed.
Okay, but it's not. It's significant sum. You would agree.
No.
To pay, you are close to a monopoly, and still you pay billions of dollars to make sure that you will continue to be a monopoly on mobile devices. Why you? What reason to pay this?
I assume it's a risk aversion. I mean,
Yeah.
If you, maybe, they think, assume that
They're buying insurance. $10 billion a year.
Well, I think what it's saying is basically,
Let's do something about the business.
Nobody's saying that Google is not making lots of money.
I mean, in theory, what it could be is that Apple is sufficiently important in the search space that if they decided to back a competitor,
Yeah.
and in theory, it could be harmful.
So it's a way to prevent competition.
It's a way to maximize the value of Google's product for Apple consumers.
It's a way to avoid competition.
It's a way to maximize Apple and Google's joint service.
It has nothing to do with competition.
Yes, no, but
I think we are running out of time, but
Yeah,
I wanted to
while you're
make
still a hit, okay?
I wanted to
Let's
make
make sure that we don't go over the
one.
tipping point where people are leaving
Yeah.
and we're left here.
Yeah. But I wanted to make just one more question, if you don't mind. So you raised some points about the consumer welfare, how we measure it, and also Professor Cremer talked about how these companies have a lot of data that has an economic value. So my question is, how do we measure that economic value, and how do we put that into the quantification of what actually consumer welfare is? And also, I had another question about innovation. So we said that there are no big tech European companies, so maybe we should ask also ourselves why, and if actually the European Commission can be put in some impediments to innovation in the European Union.
So on your second point, I mean, one thing which I think is, Xavier asked a question about anti-American. One thing which is, and I agree with the answer that I don't think it's very much protectionism there. One thing which is very unpleasant, on the other hand, is that European politicians are using, anti-competitive or allegedly anti-competitive behavior by big tech companies as an excuse for not doing anything for European innovation. And that's very true of French governments all over, and that's really bad. Okay, so there are lots and lots of things. It's not the fact that Google or Facebook or Amazon is behaving in a nasty way or anti-competitively, which is creating, which is making European having a backlog in terms of innovation. So this is something. And your first question was?
How do we measure? How do we quantify the value of data?
We can't. We know lots of ways on which you cannot do it. Okay, and you can go to lots of conferences of accountants who tell you, oh, we need to integrate the data in the assets of a firm, and you say that. How do you do this? I mean, the data is you need to know the whole set of data which is available outside of a firm in order to determine what's the value of the data. We don't know how to do it. I mean, we can make lots of theories about it, but I don't think that in practice we can really measure the value.
Okay.
Okay, all right. This is just to say thank you. Thank you very much. You've been a great panel. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.